Danny, from another, I mentioned before that you spent 2 years at the White House. Can you share us some of the lessons learned from this point of view, the high administration?
So from quantum computing to U.S. politics. I think most relevant to the discussions on this panel, the broader questions of cybersecurity policy, internet policy. I've been working on these issues for many years, really, since the early 90s when the internet first kind of emerged as a phenomenon that policymakers had to pay attention to. But I would say it was not until about this time, the period between 2008 and 2012, that the most senior policymakers and political officials in the United States had to really think hard about the internet. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that President Obama, in a certain way, was only could become president because of the internet. And what do I mean by that? You'll remember, if you paid attention to U.S. politics, in 2008, it was obvious that Hillary Clinton was going to be the nominee, the Democratic nominee for president, as she now is. But it was obvious to everyone, and Barack Obama came along as a relatively unknown candidate with relatively little political support and was able to use the decentralized power of the internet, of the web, of things like Facebook, to mount an insurgent political campaign and win. So it meant that all of us who came into the White House were very aware of the importance of the internet as a social phenomenon. The second thing that happened that I think was quite instructive, we had a debate around 2011, 2012 about some changes to U.S. copyright law. It was a provision called SOPA. Some of you might know about it, but it was frankly a relatively obscure proposal that did involve using certain features of the internet in a very particular way in order to catch copyright infringement that happened beyond U.S. borders. That is, if websites outside the reach of U.S. law were purveying illegal intellectual property, then there would be ways under this law to block access to those sites to protect U.S. intellectual property holders. This seemed an uncontroversial proposal, but it involved using this critical part of the internet called the domain name system, basically the thing that translates the web addresses, the URLs that you're used to, that you can read, into strings of numbers that are the actual addresses for computers. And there was a concern from a number of internet engineers that this particular use of the domain name system could really disrupt the way this system works, and that there would be a big risk to passing this law. And this concern grew, and a number of civil society activist groups fixated on this and began to warn that passing this law called SOPA could, quote, break the internet. Now, as a kind of an engineering matter, I don't think any of us knows what it would mean to, quote, break the internet. It's supposed to be relatively unbreakable, in fact, by design. But there was a concern that actually spread around the whole world that the U.S. might pass a law that would, quote, break the internet. And it became a big popular discussion. I'll give you one data point that I think indicates what the transition that happened in the White House in the political process. We had a system on the White House website which is called We the People. It was a petition site that allowed people to write online petitions to the president, and if you got a certain number of votes for your petition, the president committed to answer whatever question you posed. So we got a question about this piece of legislation, SOPA. And there were nearly 1 million Americans who signed this petition. And I asked and it was my responsibility to formulate an answer. So I asked the people who ran this service to tell me where these signatures came from. I suspected that the signatures would be concentrated on the East Coast, on the West Coast, perhaps around the universities. But in fact, They were almost evenly distributed across the entire country. Every single one of the 435 congressional districts that were broken up into politically had signatures from them. And this sent a very powerful signal to policymakers that the internet was no longer a special purpose concern. It was no longer just a concern of Silicon Valley. It was no longer just a concern of certain activists. It was a concern for everyone, that everyone spread out all around the country cared about whether the internet was going to, quote, break or not. Now, we ended up deciding not to support this piece of legislation because we actually were concerned it would have negative implications. But I think that has set off, in a certain way around the world, a recognition that as policymakers approach the internet environment, they have to do so in a way that recognizes that this is not a case of kind of technocratic, expert policy making, that it's something that's going to affect everyone, whether it's on issues like security or privacy or access or other issues. So I would say that was probably the most important lesson I learned from being in government.